The evening had started like any other Friday night gathering at Jason's place. 6 of us huddled around the weathered oak table that had seen countless game nights, pizza boxes, and spilled drinks over the years. The familiar scent of microwave popcorn hung in the air as we settled into our usual spots. I was wedged between Sarah and Mike, with Jason at the head of the table, his fingers drumming impatiently as he waited for everyone to get comfortable. The soft glow from the overhead pendant light cast long shadows across the room, creating that intimate atmosphere that made these game nights feel like a sanctuary from our hectic lives. "Everyone ready?" Jason asked, his eyes gleaming with that competitive spark I'd come to recognize over our 15 years of friendship. We all nodded, some more enthusiastically than others. It was supposed to be a simple card game, something new Jason had picked up at that quirky board game store downtown. The rules seemed straightforward enough when he explained them, but there was always something about Jason's explanations that left crucial details in the shadows, only to be revealed when it was most inconvenient for the rest of us. The first few rounds went smoothly. We were divided into 2 teams, sitting on opposite sides of the table. Sarah, Mike, and I formed one team, while Jason, Emma, and Daniel made up the other. The game required strategy, a bit of deception, and the ability to read your opponent's intentions. I was surprisingly good at it, much to Jason's visible annoyance. Our team had pulled ahead, and the competitive tension was building with each card played. Then came the moment that would transform our ordinary game night into something altogether different. We had just completed a particularly intense round, one that had left Jason's team trailing by a significant margin. As we prepared for the next round, shuffling cards and refilling drinks, Jason suddenly announced, "Switch sides," with a casual authority that suggested this was a perfectly normal request. We all looked at him, confused but compliant, and began to rise from our seats. But here's where things took a turn for the bizarre. Jason didn't move. He remained firmly planted in his chair, dead center on his side of the table. Emma and Daniel, who had been sitting on either side of him, stood awkwardly, waiting for some indication of where they should go. The rest of us had already started to shift around the table, but Jason's immobility created a strange tension in the room. It was as if the air had suddenly become thicker, harder to move through. "Aren't you going to move?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying a hint of the irritation she rarely displayed. Jason simply shook his head, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. It was the kind of smile that made you wonder if you were the subject of some private joke, a feeling I'd experienced more than once in our long friendship. Let me tell you a bit about Jason. He's always been the orchestrator of our group, the one who plans the gatherings and decides what games we'll play. There's a certain charisma about him that draws people in, makes them want to please him, even when his requests border on the unreasonable. He works as an architect, and perhaps that's where his need for control stems from. This desire to design not just buildings, but social interactions, to see how people will respond when faced with unexpected situations. I've known Jason since college, where we shared a cramped dorm room and learned to navigate each other's quirks and habits. He was studying architecture while I pursued journalism, 2 fields that rarely intersected except in our late-night discussions about how spaces influence human behavior. Those conversations would often stretch until dawn, fueled by cheap coffee and the boundless energy of youth. It was during one of these talks that Jason first expressed his fascination with social experiments, with creating scenarios to see how people would react. At the time, I found it intriguing, even admirable. Now, standing awkwardly by the table while he refused to move, I was less enchanted by his methods. Sarah, on the other hand, had only known Jason for a few years. They'd met through a mutual friend at a charity event, and she'd been pulled into our circle with the gravitational force that Jason exerted. She worked as a pediatric nurse, her days filled with genuine emergencies and real human needs. Perhaps that's why she had little patience for Jason's games within games. Her brown eyes narrowed as she stood there, waiting for an explanation that wasn't forthcoming. Mike was more amused than annoyed. A software developer with a penchant for puzzles, he likely saw Jason's behavior as just another problem to solve. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching the scenario unfold with the detached interest of an observer rather than a participant. Emma and Daniel, the newest additions to our group, exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their uncertainty. They had been dating for only a few months, and these game nights were still relatively new territory for them. Emma's background in psychology made her particularly attuned to the group dynamics at play, while Daniel's easygoing nature usually allowed him to go with the flow, regardless of how strange the current might become. "Jason," I finally said, breaking the uncomfortable silence that had descended upon the room. "What exactly are you doing?" My voice came out calmer than I felt, years of friendship having taught me that direct confrontation rarely yielded results with him. "I told you all to switch sides," he replied, his tone suggesting that he was being perfectly reasonable. "I never said I would be switching." Emma let out a small laugh, the kind that comes from discomfort rather than amusement. "So where are we supposed to sit?" she asked, gesturing to the limited space at the table. With Jason remaining firmly in the middle of his side, the configuration we had maintained throughout the evening was no longer possible. "Figure it out," Jason said, taking a sip from his beer with infuriating casualness. "That's part of the game." But it wasn't part of the game, at least not the card game we had been playing. This was a different game altogether, one with rules that only Jason seemed to understand. The rest of us were left to navigate this new terrain without a map, trying to decipher what was expected of us. Daniel was the first to make a move. With a shrug that suggested he was willing to play along, he walked around the table and took the seat I had previously occupied. "Is this what you mean?" he asked Jason, who merely nodded, that enigmatic smile still playing on his lips. The rest of us remained standing, caught in a strange limbo between compliance and resistance. The simple instruction to switch sides had transformed into something far more complex, a test of sorts, though none of us were quite sure what we were being tested on. It was as if Jason had introduced a new dimension to the evening, one that transcended the cards and scores and ventured into the realm of social psychology. Sarah was the first to voice what many of us were thinking. "This is ridiculous," she said, placing her hands on her hips. "If you want us to switch sides, you should move too. That's only fair." Jason's response was to lean back in his chair, creating even more space around him, a physical manifestation of his refusal to budge. "Life isn't always fair," he said, with the air of someone imparting great wisdom. "Sometimes you have to adapt to circumstances beyond your control." Mike snorted at this. "Circumstances beyond our control? You're literally creating this situation right now." Jason shrugged, unmoved by Mike's logic. "Am I? Or am I simply revealing something that was already there?" This cryptic response did nothing to clarify the situation, but it did succeed in further dividing our reactions. Emma, with her background in psychology, seemed increasingly intrigued by Jason's behavior. She moved to take a seat on the opposite side of the table, following Daniel's lead. "I think I see what you're doing," she said to Jason, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely sure. Mike and Sarah remained standing, their postures reflecting their growing irritation. I found myself caught in the middle, not just physically as I stood at the end of the table, but emotionally as well. Part of me wanted to call Jason out on his manipulative behavior, to demand that he either explain himself or end this strange standoff. But another part of me was curious to see where this would lead, what insights might emerge from this unexpected disruption to our routine. The tension in the room was palpable now, a living thing that seemed to breathe and expand with each passing moment. What had started as a simple game night had evolved into something far more complex, a microcosm of larger dynamics that played out in our relationships every day. Jason's refusal to move from the middle had created a power imbalance that forced the rest of us to reconsider our positions, both literally and figuratively. Let me explain why this matters. In that moment, we were confronting questions that extend far beyond a Friday night game. How do we respond when someone changes the rules without warning? Do we adapt, resist, or simply walk away? These questions resonate in our personal relationships, our workplaces, even in our engagement with larger social and political systems. Jason's seemingly trivial command to switch sides had opened up a space for examining these deeper issues. As I stood there, watching my friends navigate this unexpected social experiment, I couldn't help but reflect on the concept of sides itself. We're constantly being asked to choose sides, in arguments, in politics, in sports, in the countless divisions that characterize modern life. There's an implicit assumption that everyone must align themselves with one position or another, that neutrality is not an option. Yet here was Jason, defiantly occupying the middle ground, refusing to be moved from his central position. Sarah finally broke the stalemate. With a decisive motion, she pulled out a chair on what had previously been Jason's side of the table and sat down. "Fine," she said, her voice tight with controlled frustration. "I'll switch sides. But I want it noted that I think this is absurd." Jason nodded solemnly, as if her protest had been officially recorded in some invisible ledger. "Noted," he said, before turning his attention to Mike and me, the last two standing. "What about you two? Where do you stand? Or sit, as the case may be?" Mike's response was to walk away from the table entirely. He moved to the couch at the far end of the room and sprawled across it, effectively removing himself from the game while still remaining in the space. It was a third option that none of us had considered, neither switching sides nor staying put, but changing the parameters of participation altogether. This left me as the only one still standing, the only one who hadn't yet made a decision. All eyes turned to me, waiting to see what I would do. In that moment, I felt the weight of choice, the significance of positioning oneself in relation to others. It was just a game night, just a quirky social dynamic playing out among friends, but it felt like something more. It felt like a moment of truth. I looked at Jason, still firmly planted in the middle of his side, neither moving nor explaining his refusal to do so. I looked at Sarah and Emma, who had switched sides as instructed, albeit with different attitudes about doing so. I looked at Daniel, who seemed content to go along with whatever was happening, and at Mike, who had opted out of the binary choice altogether. "I think," I said slowly, measuring my words, "that I'm going to stay right where I am." And with that, I pulled out the chair at the head of the table, a spot that had been unoccupied throughout the evening, and sat down. From this position, I wasn't clearly on either side. I was establishing a new space, one that acknowledged the changed dynamics while refusing to be defined solely in relation to Jason's command. Jason's expression flickered with something I couldn't quite identify: surprise, perhaps, or a grudging respect. He hadn't anticipated this move, and for once, he seemed unsure of how to respond. The balance of power had shifted, ever so slightly, in a direction he hadn't mapped out. "Interesting choice," he finally said, his voice carefully neutral. "Care to explain your reasoning?" I took a moment before responding, aware that my answer would shape the next phase of this unexpected social experiment. "I'm not refusing to switch sides," I said. "I'm questioning the premise that there are only two sides to switch between. By staying in the middle, like you are, I'm creating a third option." The parallel to Jason's own position wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Emma nodded thoughtfully, her psychologist's mind no doubt cataloging this interaction for future reference. Sarah's expression softened slightly, her initial irritation giving way to a more nuanced consideration of what was unfolding. Even Mike, from his removed position on the couch, seemed to be paying closer attention now. Jason leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his gaze fixed on me. And what if everyone chose that third option? What if everyone decided to stay in the middle? It was a good question, one that probed at the sustainability of neutrality in a world that often demands clear allegiances. "Then the concept of sides becomes meaningless," I replied. "Or maybe it evolves into something more complex than a binary division." Daniel, who had been quietly observing until now, joined the conversation. "Isn't that kind of what's happening right now? We're all in different positions, but none of us are really on clear sides anymore. The original teams have been dissolved." He was right. The neat division that had characterized our gameplay earlier in the evening had given way to a more fluid arrangement, one that reflected individual choices rather than prescribed positions. Jason's command to switch sides had paradoxically led to the dissolution of the very concept of sides. Emma built on this observation. "It's like what happens in group dynamics when an established structure is disrupted. People have to renegotiate their relationships and positions. We're doing that right now, creating a new social order in response to the disruption." Jason's smile widened at this analysis. "Exactly," he said, with the satisfaction of someone whose experiment was yielding the desired results. "That's exactly what I wanted to see." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "So this was a test? You were studying us?" There was an edge to her question, a justified wariness about being treated as subjects rather than friends. Jason must have heard it too, because his expression became more serious, more genuine than it had been all evening. Not a test, he clarified. More of an exploration. I've been thinking a lot lately about how easily we fall into prescribed roles and positions, how rarely we question the boundaries that are set for us. I wanted to see what would happen if those boundaries were suddenly called into question. Mike rejoined the conversation from his position on the couch. You could have just asked us to talk about it, you know. Not everything has to be a social experiment. Jason acknowledged this with a slight nod. True. But would the conversation have been the same? Would we have discovered the same things about ourselves and each other if we had approached it theoretically rather than experientially? He had a point, though I wasn't entirely ready to concede it. There was something unsettling about being maneuvered into a situation without consent, even if the intentions behind it were intellectually interesting. Yet I couldn't deny that the experience had revealed aspects of our group dynamic that might have remained hidden in a more conventional discussion. So what now? Daniel asked, bringing us back to the practical question of how to proceed with the evening. Do we go back to the card game? Or? Jason looked around at all of us, taking in our various positions around the room. I think we've moved beyond the card game, he said. But maybe there's something else we can play, something that acknowledges the new configuration we've created. And so began a different kind of game night, one that evolved organically from the disruption Jason had introduced. We ended up pushing the table aside and sitting in a rough circle on the floor, sharing stories about times we had found ourselves caught between sides, times we had switched allegiances, times we had created new paths when the existing options seemed insufficient. It was a deeper level of connection than our usual game nights provided, a more vulnerable exchange that revealed aspects of each other we hadn't seen before. Sarah spoke about the ethical dilemmas she faced as a nurse, the times when hospital policy conflicted with what she believed was best for her patients. Mike shared his struggles navigating the corporate culture at his tech company, where taking sides in office politics could make or break a career. Emma and Daniel, still relatively new to our group, opened up about the challenges of merging their social circles as their relationship became more serious. And Jason, the architect of the evening's unexpected turn, spoke about his own ambivalence toward the rigid structures he created in his professional life. There's something both comforting and constraining about clear boundaries, he admitted. I design spaces that guide people's movements, that shape their experiences in predetermined ways. But sometimes I wonder what would happen if I introduced more ambiguity, more room for individual interpretation. As he spoke, I began to understand his behavior earlier in the evening from a new perspective. His refusal to move from the middle wasn't just an arbitrary power play. It was an expression of his own internal conflict about the roles we play and the positions we occupy. By disrupting our game night routine, he had externalized that conflict, inviting us to engage with it alongside him. The evening stretched late into the night, our conversation winding through personal anecdotes, philosophical questions, and practical considerations about how we navigate a world that constantly asks us to choose sides. When we finally began to gather our things and prepare to leave, there was a sense of having shared something significant, something that would alter the dynamic of our friendship group in subtle but lasting ways. As I was putting on my coat, Jason approached me, his expression more open than it had been earlier. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for seeing what I was trying to do, even before I fully explained it." I nodded, acknowledging his gratitude while still maintaining a slight reserve. It was an interesting experiment, I conceded. Though maybe next time, a heads-up would be appreciated before you throw us into an existential crisis. He laughed at that, a genuine sound that dispelled the last of the tension between us. Fair enough, though I can't promise there won't be other surprises. That's part of what makes life interesting, don't you think? The unexpected turns, the moments when we have to reconsider our positions. As I drove home that night, I found myself reflecting on Jason's words and the events of the evening. There was truth in what he said about the value of disruption, about the insights that can emerge when established patterns are broken. But there was also wisdom in Mike's objection, in the idea that not everything needs to be an experiment, that sometimes direct communication is the more respectful approach. Perhaps the real lesson of the evening was about balance, finding that middle ground between structure and flexibility, between clear sides and the ambiguous center. It's a balance we all navigate in our daily lives, as we decide when to take a stand and when to remain open to multiple perspectives, when to switch sides and when to hold our ground. In the days that followed, Our group text thread was unusually active, with reflections and follow-up thoughts about the conversation we'd had. Something had shifted in our dynamic, a new depth of understanding that made our subsequent gatherings more meaningful, more authentic. Jason's strange command and his refusal to move from the middle had catalyzed a transformation in our friendship, opening up spaces for connection that might otherwise have remained unexplored. And isn't that, in the end, what friendship is about? Creating safe spaces to question, to explore, to reconsider our positions and perspectives. Sometimes it takes an unexpected disruption, a command to switch sides, followed by a refusal to move, to remind us of the fluid, evolving nature of our relationships and our identities. In that moment of confusion and realignment, we discover new possibilities for understanding ourselves and each other, new ways of being together in the complex, ever-changing landscape of human connection. Total _count, 13,983.